Less than half a mile outside the walls of Pompeii, buried under the ash, excavators found a wooden container. Inside it were wax tablets, more than 100 of them. Loans, receipts, court business. The working archive of a family of bankers who operated out of the port at Puteoli. Financial records belong in a strongroom inside a city. These were outside the city. Somebody may have carried them out, or they may always have been kept out there in a building by the river, and the eruption simply found them where they lived. The ground does not decide it. What the ground does decide is that the box was not alone out there. There are people beyond the walls, on the roads, at the gates, in the fields between the city and the sea. Whatever else was happening at Pompeii on the day the mountain opened, the city was not standing still. It was emptying. The account almost everyone carries about Pompeii is that it was caught, stopped mid-gesture, a city photographed by accident. That account exists because the casts really do look like that. It is not a foolish reading. It is the reading the objects invite. It is also hard to reconcile with the numbers. Excavation at Pompeii has recovered around 1,150 sets of human remains. At Herculaneum, around 300. How many people lived in the two towns is genuinely disputed. The honest range runs from a few thousand to several tens of thousands, and specialists do not agree. So this film will not give a survival percentage because nobody can. What can be shown is where some of them went. The historian Stephen Tuck has traced distinctive Pompeian and Herculanean family names into the towns up the coast. Cumae, Naples, Puteoli, Ostia, where those names appear only after the year 79. Refugee families resurfacing. His method has a hole in it, and he is the one who points it out. It cannot see anyone who moved in with relatives who shared their name. It cannot see anyone without a Roman family name at all, which excludes most of the enslaved. It undercounts. Every correction anyone has proposed to it runs in the same direction. So, people got out. We can name families who did. How many is not a recoverable number. But nobody escaped is not what the ground says, and it is not what the towns up the coast say either. So the question is not why nobody escaped. The question is what the rest of them were doing, and why the thing they did was the thing that killed them. Whatever they did it against a hazard they had to sort into a category first. And for something falling out of the sky, there were two. Impact is a thing hitting you. Load is a thing accumulating on top of you. Different problems, opposite solutions. Against impact, the answer is a roof. Against load, the answer is to get out from under one. There is a second sorting, and it matters more. A hazard a society has a procedure for, and a hazard it does not. Campania had a procedure for earthquakes. In the early 60s, a severe one struck the region. Seneca devoted an entire book of his natural questions to it. Pompeii was still rebuilding when the mountain opened, more than 15 years later. Earthquakes were understood, survivable, familiar. They were a category. Eruptions were not. Now, it is often said that Romans had no concept of a volcano at all. That is not true, and the truth is stranger. The geographer Strabo, writing before the eruption, looked at Vesuvius and noted that the rock near the summit appeared to have been eaten by fire. Vitruvius made much the same observation and drew the comparison with Etna. The idea existed in books. It did not exist in anyone's expectations about that particular hill, which was covered in vines and had done nothing whatsoever in living memory. Pliny the Elder wrote about burning mountains. He did not put Vesuvius among them. He died at the foot of it. Sometime in the early afternoon, the mountain opened. Pliny the Younger was across the bay at Misenum. He was 17. He wrote his account 25 years later at the request of the historian Tacitus, and it is the only narrative eyewitness record of the eruption that survives. He remembered his mother pointing out a cloud of unusual size and shape. From that distance, nobody could tell which mountain it was rising from. At Pompeii, 6 miles from the vent, small stones began to fall. They were light. Pumice is mostly air. A handful of it weighs almost nothing. For the first hour or so, it was not dangerous. It did not stop. It fell for 18 hours. Partway through, the deposit changes color. White pumice gives way to gray. That line is still there in the ground. The moment the eruption began drawing from deeper in the chamber and got worse. By then, the weight on the roofs was measured in feet. The first ones went in the afternoon. The numbers that follow come from a study published in 2003, which mapped where in the deposits each recovered victim was found. It is still the best analysis available. Of the victims recovered from the pumice layer, the ones who died during the fall, before anything hot arrived, the great majority were not in the streets. 345 of them were indoors, 88%. Then, in the early hours, it stopped falling. That was not the end of it. What came next came down the mountain rather than out of the sky, and at Pompeii, it killed more people than the falling stone had. But for a while, in the dark, the sky was quiet. At the Porta Nola, on the northeastern edge of the city, excavators found a small group of people. They were lying above the pumice, not under it. They had survived all of it. The 18 hours, the dark, the roofs coming down in the streets around them. They came out into the lull, and they walked. 2 of them had fractured legs. One was using a fallen branch as a walking stick. The gate is as far as they got. Consider what that means for the ones still inside. Leaving was not the free option. It had not been the free option for hours. Every account that treats the dead of Pompeii as people who failed to walk out through an open door is describing a door that was not open. So the question changes again. If going was that hard and staying was that dangerous, then the people who went indoors were not doing nothing. They were doing something specific, and it was the wrong thing. What matters is why it was the obvious thing. And obvious is not a fact about the sky. It is a fact about what a person already has to think with. That has been tested under conditions nothing like a burning mountain. In 1932, a psychologist at Cambridge named Frederick Bartlett published the results of a long and rather strange experiment. He gave English readers an unfamiliar folk tale, a Native American story with a structure and a logic that matched nothing in their experience. Then he asked them to write it out from memory. Then again, weeks later, then again, months after that, the story changed. That was expected. What was not expected was the direction it changed in. Details that did not fit the reader's expectations were not simply lost. They were converted. Canoes became boats. Unfamiliar elements were replaced with familiar ones. Over successive tellings, the story reorganized itself into a story an English reader would already know. Bartlett's conclusion was that remembering is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, assembled each time against the structures a person already carries. The experiment was informal by the standards of the field today. The finding has held. This is not the claim that people are careless or confused or bad at paying attention. His subjects were doing the task properly. The conversion is not a fault in the process, it is the process. But Bartlett was studying memory. What happens to material on the way out? The claim this film needs is larger, that it also happens on the way in. That claim has its own evidence, and it does not come from a laboratory. It comes from people who study how human beings actually behave in the first minutes of a real emergency. Fires, floods, warnings, alarms. A field that has existed since the 1960s, built on interviews with survivors while the event was still recent. The finding is consistent, and it is not the one most people expect. The characteristic failure in an unfamiliar emergency is not panic. Panic is rare. What people do is seek confirmation. They look for somebody else's reaction. They ask whether this is normal. They read the ambiguous signal as the ordinary thing it most resembles, and they finish what they were doing. Researchers have a name for it: normalcy bias. The consequence is the part that matters here. Information that does not fit the available model is not rejected, it is smoothed toward it. So, stones are falling out of the sky in enormous quantity. There is a category for that on a bookshelf in Alexandria. in a geography nobody in this street has read. There is no category for it in this street. What there is debris. And the correct response to debris is a roof. That is the answer for the people inside the city. It is not obvious that it is only about them. Every number in this film is a count of remains that somebody excavated. Roughly a third of Pompeii has never been dug at all, and the digging that has happened is not evenly distributed. The interiors of houses have been worked over for 2.5 centuries. The roads beyond the walls, the fields, the shoreline, far less. A dig concentrated inside buildings will find its victims inside buildings. The objection is real. It is also answered, and the answer is already in this film. The group at the Porta Nola were outside the walls, above the pumice, in exactly the kind of place the objection says is under-searched. They were found, they were counted, they are in the numbers, and they died anyway. Staying was not passivity, it was a judgment, and under the model available, it was the better one. But notice what almost happened there. For most of 2 centuries, a dig that looked mostly indoors produced a picture of people who stayed indoors, and nobody thought to ask whether the picture was about the victims or about the dig. That is the same mechanism, pointed the other way. On the other side of the mountain, Herculaneum had a different day. 4 miles from the vent, closer than Pompeii, but upwind, almost no pumice fell there. No roofs came down. For most of the 18 hours, Herculaneum was a town watching a catastrophe happen somewhere else. And when excavators reached it, they found almost nobody. For decades, the assumption was that Herculaneum had got out in good order. Then, in the 1980s, the digging reached the ancient shoreline. There is a row of stone chambers there, opening onto what used to be the beach, boat sheds. Inside them, and on the sand outside, were around 300 people. They had not failed to evacuate. They had evacuated. They had gone to the water, which is where a Roman coastal town goes. For fire, for flood, for raiders. For almost any emergency it has a procedure for. They were waiting for boats. Pliny explains, from the other side of the bay, why the boats were not coming. The sea had pulled back. The wind was wrong. His uncle's ships could get in and could not get out. The evacuation was correct. The evacuation was maritime, and the eruption had closed the sea some hours earlier. There is one more thing to say here, and it is about us. For most of 2 centuries, the assumption was that these people suffocated, slowly, in the dark, in the ash. Then volcanologists working on the deposits argued that the currents reaching them carried temperatures in the hundreds of degrees, and that death would have been effectively immediate. That work is contested. A 2018 paper pushing the argument further drew a formal published objection, and other researchers examining the bone itself have reported less heat alteration than the theory predicts, which points back toward the slower death. So the honest position is that the most repeated detail about this event is the one specialists are least able to agree on, which has not slowed the retelling down at all. Because the pictures are stronger than the papers. In 1863, the director of the excavations, Giuseppe Fiorelli, worked out that the voids in the ash were people. Bodies decay. The compacted ash around them does not. What is left is a mold. Fiorelli filled it. Around 104 individuals have been cast this way. They are the most reproduced images of the ancient world, and they are the reason everyone believes they already know what happened at Pompeii. 2 recent findings about what those objects actually record. The first, during conservation work on damaged casts, researchers recovered fragments of bone and sequenced the DNA. The results were published in 2024. 5 individuals, a small sample, and it should be held as one. One cast shows an adult wearing a gold bracelet with a child on their lap. Since the 19th century, it has been described as a mother shielding her child. The adult is genetically male. The 2 are not related. Another pair, long presented as sisters who died in an embrace, includes at least 1 genetic male. The second finding is the harder one. A large proportion of the Pompeii casts show flexed arms and drawn-up legs. It has been read for a century and a half as terror, or as shielding, or as struggling to breathe. Volcanologists have argued it is none of those. Extreme heat shortens muscle and tendon after death and pulls a body into that shape. The postures were formed after death. Not everywhere. The group at the gate show nothing of the kind. They lie slack, some with cloth drawn across the face. Some of what survives is heat. Some of it is genuinely them. Nobody has a reliable way to tell which is which. And for 150 years, nobody knew they needed one. In October 2018, the archaeological park announced a discovery. On a wall in a newly excavated house, someone had written a date in charcoal, the 17th of October. The reasoning was that charcoal is fragile and cannot survive long exposure, so the writing had to be recent. So the eruption had to be later in the year than anyone had thought. It went around the world. It was a competent reading. It was made against the model available. Then the park tested it. They went back to a wall in the open air and wrote on it in charcoal. Then they left it there through a Campanian winter and watched. 10 months later, it was still legible. The director reported almost no loss of clarity. The model was wrong. Charcoal lasts. The October writing could have been on that wall since the previous autumn. In December 2024, the park published the reversal itself. A separate study had already taken apart the linguistic argument for an autumn date, and then it went one step past its own evidence. The site's position now is that any date other than the 24th of August is invention. The experiment did not show that. It showed that the October reading had nothing holding it up. Whether Pliny's manuscripts are right is a different question, and nobody has closed it. The correction overcorrected against the model available. They did not fail to react. They reacted correctly to the wrong thing. The room that inscription is written in is a room where people sheltered. Pompeii keeps recording the people who look at it. If you want more histories where the evidence is shown and the gaps are named, subscribe to The Inner History.